"That medal's fake, old man. Ain't no way you earned that." The voice cut through the quiet hum of morning like a blade through cloth. Too loud, too amused. Heads didn't turn right away, not yet, but a few forks paused midway to mouths. Walt Mallory didn't lift his eyes. He kept them trained on the patch of sunlight sliding across his coffee cup, one veined hand resting lightly on the tabletop beside a small velvet box, now open. A medal glinted in the light, dull from age, not polish. The ribbon was frayed. The silence around him felt tight. "Come on," the younger man went on, pulling out a chair as if he belonged there, all swagger and smirk. "You buy that thing on the internet? Or did your grandson print it in art class?" His friend chuckled behind him, phone already in hand, recording like this was some kind of show. "We're doing a public service here. Can't let some cosplaying geezer scam free coffee on the taxpayer's dime." The chair scraped against the tile. The second man leaned forward, fingers already reaching. "Let's get a closer look. That's a real United States Army medal, huh? Which war, Gramps? The Civil?" He snatched the medal without asking, pinching it like it was a counterfeit coin. Still, Walt didn't speak. He didn't flinch either. Instead, he reached slowly for his cloth napkin, unfolded it with deliberate care, and began wiping the edge of his knife. The movement was too steady to be frail, too focused to be frightened. "Man, he's not even gonna say anything," the first one muttered. "You sure he's awake?" Walt placed the knife beside his plate, picked up his coffee cup with a hand that trembled only slightly, and took a sip. Then he looked up, not at the boys, but past them, over their shoulders, eyes narrowing just a fraction, like he'd caught something faint on the wind. And across the room, a man stood. He had risen from his booth without sound, leaving a full cup of coffee untouched. He adjusted the sleeve of his coat as he stepped forward, not hurried, not loud, but with a stillness that quieted something in the air. If the two boys noticed him, they didn't show it, but others in the diner did. A waitress froze mid-step. A pair of retirees, silent until now, exchanged a look. Walt's eyes stayed fixed on the man who was walking. His hand, now resting on the edge of the table, curled once, just slightly. But the soldier wasn't alone. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The smell of sizzling bacon lingered heavy in the air, threaded with the faint bite of black coffee and something older, a scent soaked into the walls over the years. Gracie's diner sat on the edge of a faded town where the streetlights hummed louder than the traffic, and the window blinds were always crooked, no matter who tried to fix them. For almost 12 years, Walt Mallory had arrived every Thursday at exactly 9:30 in the morning, with the punctuality of a man who once calibrated radios in the dark under shellfire. He came alone, always in the same well-pressed wool coat, collar turned just slightly up even in spring, like he never fully trusted the weather. His movements were slow, measured, never hurried, but there was a practiced economy to them. Nothing wasted, nothing unsure. The booth by the far window was his. No one had ever dared sit there before him, not because of any sign or spoken rule, but because, over time, people simply knew. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The space belonged to him in the quiet way that trees belong to the land they grow from. This morning had started like any other. A slight tremble in the fingers as he slid into his seat. A polite nod to the waitress, young, kind, always with tired eyes and a soft way of placing the menu down, even though he never needed it. "Black coffee? Rye toast? No butter?" she had asked, and he had replied with the same quiet nod he always gave. But today he'd brought something else with him, a small, faded velvet case, the kind that carried more weight than it ever seemed to from the outside. He had set it down beside his plate like a companion, then opened it without fanfare. Inside, the metal. Metal dulled by time, edges worn smooth. It lay there quietly, like it had waited decades to breathe again. He didn't look at it. Not directly. but every so often his gaze drifted toward it, not to admire, more like to remember. A waitress passed by, glanced down at it, hesitated for a moment, and then walked on. The clink of plates, the low murmur of conversations, the scraping of a fork against ceramic, all of it framed the stillness of Walt's booth like a picture too old to repaint. There were small signs of strain, if one cared to look, a faint tremor in the hand that lifted his coffee, a wince so subtle it could have been a blink when he reached for the toast. But there was nothing frail in his presence. He sat upright, shoulders slightly back, as if decades of posture couldn't be unlearned by pain or time. No one knew much about him, not really. Some whispered he had been something in communications during the Korean War. Others thought he worked in code breaking. A few said he'd never really left the service, just faded into civilian life the way old soldiers do, not by vanishing, but by blending into the background of everyday America, carrying things too heavy to speak aloud. What people did know was this: Walt Mallory didn't talk much, but he always tipped in exact bills, always folded his napkin before leaving, and always sat with his left shoulder just slightly turned away from the window, a habit only a fellow veteran might notice. The stories of men like him weren't written in history books. They were written in creases around the eyes, in the precision of how one folds a coat, in the quiet endurance of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. He hadn't touched the metal since placing it down. He simply let it sit, let it be seen. But not everyone in the diner was a stranger to the sound of disrespect. The laughter hadn't quite stopped. It had grown quieter, yes, more contained now, as if even the two young men sensed they were brushing too close to a line, though they hadn't yet decided whether to cross it or not. The first boy, lanky, with a face too smooth to have seen consequence, nudged his friend with an elbow and leaned closer to Walt's booth again, uninvited and unimpressed. Walt didn't move. He had resumed eating, slow and deliberate, with motions so precise they seemed more ritual than habit. He cut the toast into clean triangles, not jagged halves, and chewed slowly, always setting his utensils down between bites. One might think he hadn't heard them, but that wasn't true. Every word still hung in the air, sharp and disrespectful, echoes bouncing silently between the clinking dishes and the quiet radio. Across the room, a waitress refilled a mug with her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the window. At a nearby table, a retired trucker with a badge-studded ball cap shifted in his seat, muttering something under his breath, though he didn't turn around. Then, with a clumsy swipe meant to look like an accident, one of the young men bumped the table hard enough to jostle Walt's cup. The water sloshed up against the rim and spilled across the tablecloth, seeping in quickly. The metal, still resting beside the plate, caught a corner of the wet and tilted slightly. Walt reached for it immediately, gently, but with the kind of quiet urgency that made one or two eyes rise from their breakfasts. He lifted it, dabbed it dry with the hem of the napkin, and returned it to the box without a word. Then he took the same napkin, folded once more, and began patting the edge of the table where the water had pooled. He didn't look at the boys, not once. But they weren't finished. "Bet he wears camouflage to the grocery store," one of them said, just loud enough to be overheard, tapping at his phone with one hand and reaching for a ketchup bottle with the other. "Probably asks for a senior discount on chewing gum." The other chuckled, then stood from his seat entirely and stretched, loud, performative. "I don't get it, man. If you're that old and that proud, shouldn't you be surrounded by plaques or a parade or something? All I see is toast and attitude." Walt placed his fork down again. His face remained unreadable, eyes slightly narrowed not in anger but in something quieter. He pulled the sleeves of his coat a little higher on his forearms, revealing faded wrists and liver-spotted hands that had once held signal wire in the freezing hills of another continent. Near the coffee station, the younger waitress, the one who always smiled at him, the one who remembered not to butter the toast, froze for a half-second with a pot in her hand. She looked toward the table, then over to the owner's corner booth, but said nothing. There were rules in places like Gracie's Diner, rules that weren't written on chalkboards or menus. You didn't cut in line at the register. You tipped when you could, and you never mouthed off to the old-timers. But rules didn't mean much to the kind of arrogance born of ignorance. The man in the corner hadn't spoken either. He sat with both hands resting flat on the table, coffee cooling in front of him. His coat was dark, simple, but the shape of his shoulders, the crisp line of his posture, those spoke louder than any uniform. Still, he hadn't moved. Not yet. Walt picked up his fork once more, wiped it neatly, and returned to his meal. A retired schoolteacher at the window shook her head. A man near the jukebox stood and paid his check early. Another customer, silent until now, rose slowly and walked out the door without finishing his meal. The air was changing. The temperature of the room had shifted, but the boys were too wrapped in their own amusement to notice. At least for now, no one had spoken. Yet. The chair scraped again. But this time it wasn't just a stretch or a lean-in. The younger of the two, the one who had held the medal like it was a toy, slid fully into Walt's booth without permission, his knee knocking the edge of the table as he sat across from the old man. He leaned his elbows forward, chin propped in one hand, expression smug and curious, like a boy daring a chained dog to bark. Walt didn't acknowledge him. He continued chewing, slow, steady, as if he were alone in a room that was growing more crowded by the minute. The second man remained standing just behind his friend, rocking lightly on his heels. He plucked a toothpick from a dispenser at the next table, popped it in his mouth, and grinned. His voice rose, not with anger but entertainment. You know, they say anyone can order one of these online. You just pick your conflict, pay a couple bucks, and boom. You're a war hero. That right, sir? You a war hero? The other one chuckled. You look more like a crossword champion than a combat veteran. Walt lifted his napkin once more, wiping the corner of his mouth with a careful grace. The kind of grace that came from years of knowing how to hold still under pressure. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The boy across from him reached toward the box again, but this time Walt's hand moved first. Not fast, just deliberate. His fingers closed over the velvet lid, drawing it shut with a soft snap that echoed louder than expected in the suddenly quieter diner. He slid the box back toward his side of the table, then rested his palm atop it. The younger man blinked at him, surprised not by force, but by certainty. "I'm just asking questions, man," he said with a theatrical shrug. "What's wrong with that? If it's real, it's real. I just think it's kind of weird to eat pancakes with a piece of government metal sitting next to your toast." Walt said nothing. His breath was steady, but one could see now the faint tightening around his eyes, the subtle flicker of something buried deeper than irritation. A memory, maybe, or a warning. The boy laughed nervously, then knocked over Walt's water glass with the back of his knuckles. It wasn't a mistake this time. The water spilled fast, washing across the tabletop, soaking into the napkin, reaching for the edge of Walt's plate. The metal box remained safe under his hand, unmoved. Still, Walt did not rise, did not shout. He simply lifted the plate, dry side up, and held it above the flood until the mess slowed. Then, slowly, he reached for a new napkin and began patting the table again, the same as before. Only now, the shaking in his hand had returned, and this time, it wasn't age. A waitress approached, face tight with discomfort. She placed a fresh cloth on the edge of the table but didn't speak. The line between stepping in and stepping too far was thin, and the rules of hospitality had not prepared her for this. Another voice came then, softer, male, from the bar stools along the window. "That's enough, boys." A man in his 60s, heavy-set with a frayed flannel collar and a faded Marine Corps pin on his ball cap. He didn't stand, but his voice carried authority. The standing boy turned his head, chewing his toothpick. "Who's gonna make it enough? You?" The man didn't answer. He just turned back to his eggs. The room dimmed in spirit. The heat from the kitchen drifted in with an odd thickness. The once cheerful jazz now sounded too slow, too detached, like it belonged in another world. Then came the worst of it. The younger one, still seated in the booth, grabbed a plastic straw from the holder, stood, and lifted it like a microphone. He placed 2 fingers to his brow and gave a sharp, mocking salute. "At ease, sir," he barked in a stiff imitation, his tone soaked in sarcasm. "Permission to finish your breakfast, General?" He laughed again, eyes sweeping the room, daring someone to challenge him. No one did. Not yet. Walt didn't look at him. He had picked up his fork again, drying it now with the corner of his sleeve, not because he had to, but because it gave his hands something to do while the storm passed. Or didn't. But there was something different now in his stillness. Not resignation. Resolve. The man at the corner table, the one who had risen before, was now halfway between his booth and Walt's. He moved without sound, coat flaring slightly as he stepped with purpose. He did not march. He glided, with the presence of someone trained to move without announcing it. The boys hadn't seen him yet, but Walt had. His hand tightened around the fork. His jaw clenched just a little more than before. He didn't move, but another man did. The straw settled slowly onto the edge of the table, dropped with a theatrical flick, as if the mock salute hadn't landed loudly enough. The boy who had given it stepped back, chewing his toothpick again like he'd just delivered a punchline in a room full of silence. The laughter he expected didn't come, only the scraping sound of a butter knife somewhere across the room, and the deep mechanical rhythm of the old ceiling fan overhead, spinning a little too slow for the heat of the day. Walt Mallory sat as though he had been carved from stone. He didn't look up. He didn't react. He simply placed the fork back down on the table beside his plate, wiped the moisture from its handle with the edge of his sleeve. A movement so precise, so instinctive, that it said more about his past than 100 stories ever could. Then he reached into the inner lining of his coat and removed a small napkin, not paper, but cloth, neatly folded into a perfect square, edges frayed by time and use. He unfolded it slowly and laid it across his lap, not to cover himself, to continue his meal with dignity. He adjusted the edge of his plate, aligned it with the corner of the table. The action was gentle but exact, the way a man might place equipment on a communications console in a field tent under hostile skies. There was a rhythm to everything he did, deliberate, practiced, unwavering. Even now, under humiliation, especially now. His fingers moved with quiet grace, never once rushing, never once breaking their choreography. He lifted the toast, now slightly soggy from the earlier spill, and turned it over carefully before taking a bite. There was no chewing of emotion, no grimace, only a slow and measured consumption of the food in front of him, as if he had decided, on principle, not to surrender the moment. A child at a table nearby whispered something to her father, who gave a soft shh and looked down into his lap, ashamed of the silence he couldn't bring himself to break. Across the room, the waitress stood by the counter with the coffee pot still in hand. Her knuckles were white around the handle. She wasn't sure if she should intervene. Wasn't sure if she could. Walt lifted his coffee cup, the rim still slightly chipped from years of use, and took a sip, a slow, steady one. When he set it down again, he adjusted the handle to face exactly south. Not a superstition, not habit, a routine. A compass inside a man who had once worked in the shadows of radio towers and signal fields, timing his every move to the beat of a larger mission. His eyes, beneath thick lenses, were calm, not cold, not angry. Just deep with the kind of patience only those who have waited out worse can carry. The young men who had mocked him had begun to falter now, not with their words, but with their posture. The one who had taken the booth was standing again, uncertain. The air was changing. The energy of the room had shifted around them, like a tide moving in without permission. No one had defended Walt with words yet, but something in the stillness had grown louder than any voice. And then, across the diner, one man moved. He rose from his seat with the kind of quiet authority that turns attention without demanding it. His movements were economical, restrained, yet every step carried the weight of years spent in command. Not just of others, but of himself. His coat, plain and brown, fell neatly over pressed trousers. He wore no visible medals, no symbols, no prideful pins, but the way he moved said everything. He was already halfway toward Walt's booth when he reached into his pocket and pressed something. A phone, maybe. Then folded it shut and returned it to his coat. His expression was unreadable, alert, watching. The boys noticed him now. One of them straightened. The other cleared his throat and stepped slightly back from the booth. Walt, for the first time in many minutes, looked up. Not at the boys, at the man approaching. Their eyes met, and in that look, something passed between them. Something without words, forged in a language older than either of them had spoken aloud in decades. A recognition, not of rank, not of story, but of experience, of standing one's ground, not through defiance, but through the unbreakable armor of quiet dignity. Walt's jaw shifted once. He folded the napkin that had rested in his lap, slowly, and placed it on the table beside the metal box. He ran a finger along the edge of the case, just once, then returned his hand to rest on the tabletop, palm flat, unshaken. Across the room, behind the sound of distant footsteps, something began to hum in the air, low, mechanical, rhythmic, almost like thunder but steadier, more focused. But Walt didn't turn to look. He already knew that sound. He had known it in another country, long ago, when it meant the cavalry was coming, not to carry you away, but to bring others in. He took another sip of coffee. The man was still approaching. The air was getting heavier, and just beyond the walls of the diner, something larger had begun to stir. The low rhythm in the air grew louder, not yet intrusive, just present, like something distant was drawing near with deliberate inevitability. But inside the diner, the tension remained tight, unbroken. The walls held the weight of it. The air ducts pushed warm air with a low hiss. Somewhere, a fork tapped gently against a plate, the only sound not coming from the breath of those who waited to see what would happen next. The man nearing Walt's table didn't rush. He walked with the kind of certainty that didn't need to announce itself. No stomp, no flinch. Just the silent rhythm of well-trained steps, measured even, light on the heel, but grounded in the ball of the foot. A gait built from thousands of miles on foreign soil. A posture shaped by decades of knowing what to carry and what to ignore. He stopped 3 feet from the booth. His eyes did not go to the boys. They went straight to Walt. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Two men, separated by a generation, but bound by something that didn't need words. Experience, discipline, brotherhood. The kind of brotherhood formed not by blood, but by shared silence under pressure. Walt gave a single, barely perceptible nod. It was returned in kind. And then, only then, did the man speak. To no one in particular. "How long's he been coming here?" The voice was calm, gravel-worn, not tired, tempered, as though each syllable had been filtered through a decade of command decisions and early morning briefings. The waitress, still holding her untouched pot of coffee like a shield, stepped toward him from behind the counter. She recognized him, not by name, but by bearing. "Years," she said softly. "Every Thursday, same booth, same order." She didn't add that Walt never complained, that he always tipped exact change, that he sometimes brought a small paper folder with an envelope inside, set it next to his coffee, and never opened it. She didn't have to. The man nodded once. "Never seen him speak," the waitress added, almost to herself. "Doesn't have to," the man replied. He took one step closer to the booth. Not too near, not invading, just near enough to be counted. The boys were watching now. Both had fallen silent. The one who had sat in the booth earlier had stepped back fully, one hand scratching the back of his neck. The toothpick was gone from the other's mouth. They stood awkwardly, like kids caught in the middle of something far larger than they'd intended to provoke. And they had. Because this wasn't just about a medal anymore. It was about something else, something they couldn't name. Not yet, but they felt it, like a cold draft crawling down their spines. The man still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was the volume. A few other patrons in the diner had straightened slightly in their seats, not out of fear, but from that old reflex, the kind that makes a man instinctively show respect when someone of substance enters a room. A retired firefighter near the window lifted his chin. A former city bus driver tapped his knuckles once against the table. Walt took another sip of his coffee. His eyes didn't leave the man standing in front of him. He knew who he was now. Maybe not by name, but by the posture, the way he had turned his body slightly, shielding Walt's side from the younger men without making it obvious, the way he carried his coat like it was still a uniform, the way he said nothing until it was time to act. There was a stillness in the booth now, heavy, solid, like a wall had been placed between Walt and the insult that had drifted across the table minutes ago. And then, from somewhere inside his coat, the man's phone buzzed. Just once. He pulled it out, glanced at it, and pressed the call to answer. He turned slightly toward the window, not out of privacy, but out of instinct, as if every action, even a conversation, should be made with awareness of the room. "This is Reed," he said calmly. "Location confirmed. Extraction window 15. There was a pause. "No changes. Proceed as briefed. I'll be on site." He closed the phone, not with haste but finality, and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he turned to the waitress again. "Name's Marcus Reed," he said simply. She nodded, unsure what to say in return. He looked once more toward Walt, and then stepped quietly to the side of the booth. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He simply placed one hand on the edge of the table, knuckles down, and waited. The boys didn't understand what was coming, but they would. And outside, that low sound was no longer faint. The air had begun to tremble, just slightly, in the glass of the diner window. The vibration in the windows had grown noticeable now. Just the faintest tremble, a kind of shiver in the glass that made the sugar packets on the counter shift slightly in their tray. No one had commented on it yet. Not the waitress, not the cook behind the pass-through window, not the regulars in their usual booths. But all of them had heard it before, somewhere, even if they couldn't place it yet. It was the kind of sound that reached the chest before the ears, a low drumbeat in the bones, a message of something coming. Marcus Reed stood with one hand resting lightly on the corner of Walt's table. His fingers curled around the edge, not gripping, just anchoring. He didn't look at the boys anymore. He didn't need to. His presence had already dimmed the room, pulled it taut with a gravity that couldn't be manufactured. The air around him carried the calm weight of a man who had been shaped in the long silence between commands, a man who had waited out firefights, and now waited out this moment with the same patience. Walt remained seated, hands resting flat on the table now, fork and knife untouched. His breathing was even, eyes soft behind the lenses of his thick glasses, but something had changed in his posture. It was subtle, almost invisible, but to those who had served, to those who had worn the same posture under far worse skies, it was clear. He had found his footing again. Not to stand, but to endure, to remain. The boy who had slipped into his booth now hovered near the counter, fidgeting with a napkin. His friend stood awkwardly beside the dessert display, arms crossed and jaw tight, as if trying to summon back the arrogance that had been so easy to wear only minutes earlier. But it was gone now, scattered like smoke in the presence of something real, something that didn't need to prove itself. Reed took a breath through his nose, shallow, steady. Then, without asking, he stepped to the side of Walt's booth and slowly, deliberately, lowered himself into the empty seat across from the old man. There was no announcement, no defiance, just the quiet weight of a man choosing his place, not by invitation, but by conviction. Walt glanced at him. The briefest look, barely a flicker of movement, then returned his gaze to the untouched triangle of toast on his plate. Reed didn't speak. He didn't nod. He simply sat with his hands folded in front of him, his spine straight, his eyes fixed softly on the tabletop. For several seconds, there was no sound in the diner, but the steady hum of the overhead lights and the faint clatter of silverware behind the kitchen doors. Even the jazz had stopped, the track having ended without anyone noticing. The absence of melody made the silence feel heavier, as though the building itself was waiting for what came next. It didn't come with words. It came with a whisper in the wind outside, and then a sound no one could ignore. A deep, pulsing beat began to press into the walls, a rhythm not of footsteps or engines, but of blades cutting air. Heavy, measured, mechanical, the unmistakable approach of something airborne, something powerful. The windows trembled more now, humming with each rotation of the unseen rotors drawing closer. Cups on tables quivered. The paper napkin dispensers buzzed against the laminate counters. And then someone near the back said what they were all thinking. "That's a helicopter." Not a question, a statement. The kind spoken by a man who had heard that sound once before, maybe on a tarmac in the desert, maybe in a training field outside of Fort Bragg, maybe just once, long ago, while watching the news with a son who didn't come home. The two young men turned to the window, but they couldn't see much, only the dancing shadows of treetops and the flutter of a newspaper that had blown off a bench outside. Reed turned his head slightly toward the door. He reached into his coat, slowly, calmly, and removed a small black wallet. From it, he drew out a square of laminated plastic and laid it on the table, face down. Walt didn't look at it. He didn't have to. Reed waited another breath, then rose to his feet. He didn't say anything to Walt, but he looked at him and held that look for a moment. Respect, not admiration, not pity, respect. Then he walked toward the door. The low, thunderous pulse of the rotors grew louder, filling the room like the tide. The windows shook now, visibly. The door to the diner groaned slightly in its frame. Dust lifted from the floorboards in invisible waves. Reed reached the threshold. He opened the door, and a wave of warm wind swept into the diner, curling napkins off tables, sending a stack of paper receipts fluttering behind the counter. The sky outside was bright, the sunlight hazy with motion, and just beyond the line of parked cars, a Black Hawk helicopter was touching down. Outside, the Black Hawk's rotors carved through the morning air in wide, thunderous arcs, sending gusts of wind across the diner's lot with the weight of memory. Leaves scattered in sudden spirals. Gravel lifted and danced along the pavement, whispering against the glass windows like dry rain. The massive bird hovered for a moment, poised, breathing mechanical thunder. Before it descended with deliberate weight, its skids kissing the earth just beyond the curb. The noise was tremendous, but inside the diner, no one moved. All eyes had shifted to the door, now swinging shut behind Marcus Reed. In the vacuum he left behind, something intangible lingered, a kind of reverent stillness that made the whole room feel like a church too aware of its sacred guest. Walt hadn't moved. His hands remained folded in front of him, fingertips lightly brushing the rim of his coffee cup. But his eyes, once dulled by restraint, now held a strange glint of knowing. He'd heard this sound before. Not just the machine, but what came with it. He didn't smile. But there was a lift in the corners of his expression, subtle, like the hint of an old memory surfacing beneath still water. Through the window, shapes moved. A single figure emerged from the bird's shadow, walking directly toward the entrance of the diner. The man was tall, composed, and unmistakably military. The creases in his uniform were so sharp they caught the light. His gait was calm, purposeful. His stride neither rushed nor lazy, just precise. A short black brim-capped silvered hair, and his chest bore only a few pins, but they weren't there for show. They spoke of rank, of decades, of the kind of experience that comes not from wearing a uniform, but living inside it. He approached the door, and this time, someone held it open for him. It was the waitress, the younger one, who had watched the earlier scene unfold with unease. She didn't speak. She just held the door like she had seen something divine approaching, and didn't know what else to do but offer entry. The man nodded once in acknowledgement, stepped inside, and the hum of rotor blades remained outside, just distant enough now to become rhythm rather than roar. The door clicked softly shut. For a heartbeat he stood there, eyes adjusting to the light inside, the warm hush of a diner suddenly transformed. Then he saw Walt, and his face changed. The stiffness in his shoulders eased, the corners of his mouth lifted, and with a sound caught between a laugh and a breath, he murmured into the stillness, "Well, I'll be damned." His boots moved swiftly across the tile floor, quiet, confident, and he approached the booth as though drawn not by duty, but gravity. Walt looked up. Their eyes locked. Neither man saluted. Neither needed to. Instead, the officer extended a hand and Walt rose, slowly, steadily, every joint a memory, and reached across the table. Their grip was firm, warm, the kind of handshake that speaks volumes with no need for volume, the kind that bridges years, the kind that says, "I remember." "Walt Mallory," the officer said, eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "Still upright, still quiet as ever. God, it's good to see you." Walt gave a faint smile. "Colonel Briggs," he said, voice like dry parchment, but steady. "Didn't expect you to come storming in like you used to." Briggs chuckled softly. "Well, the years slowed me down, but the birds still move when they're told." The officer then glanced at the metal box resting beside the empty plate. Colonel Thomas Briggs, United States Army, now visibly seasoned and steady, turned toward the rest of the diner, and with a voice made for command, yet softened by reverence, he spoke. "This man," he said, gesturing to Walt without pomp, "taught me how to think like a soldier, not in battle, long before that, back when I was a raw recruit, too fast with my hands and too slow with my judgment. Signal School, 1965, Fort Monmouth." He paused, scanning the room. "I made a mistake during a drill that could have cost us a satellite link in a combat theater. Walt here, Staff Sergeant Mallory at the time, took me aside, didn't scream, didn't write me up, just asked me if I wanted to lead or just wear the uniform. That question saved my career, probably saved lives down the line." He turned, meeting the stunned gaze of the two young men by the window. Their postures had shrunk into themselves, eyes unsure, guilt creeping into the corners of their expressions. "You mock him because you don't know who he is," the officer continued, voice steady. "But he's the reason men like me knew how to do our jobs. Men like him kept the lights on in places you've never seen. They held the line in ways that never made the news, but made all the difference." He looked back to Walt now, voice softer. "You gave me what no one else did back then. Time, and patience, and belief. That's something I never forgot." Walt inclined his head slightly, not in pride, but in acknowledgement. His eyes were misted now, not with sentiment, but memory. He whispered something too quiet to catch. A name, perhaps. A date. The officer placed a hand lightly on Walt's shoulder. "I had no idea you were here, Walt," he said with a smile. "But I'm damn glad I came through today." Reed re-entered the diner then, coat open, eyes flicking from man to man. He gave a single, meaningful glance to the officer, then to Walt. No need for instruction, no need for words. All three of them knew what was next. The officer straightened, gave one final nod to the room, not to demand respect, but to leave it behind. "We've got to go," he said. "Duty calls." He looked again at the young men near the window. "This time I'll let you watch, and I hope you remember." Then he turned, Reed falling into step beside him, and together they exited the diner. The door swung open once more. The hum of the Black Hawk flooded the room, and as they walked toward it, boots steady on concrete, every eye inside followed them. They didn't turn back. They didn't need to. The wind swallowed them whole, and then they were gone. The door swung shut behind Colonel Thomas Briggs and Marcus Reed, and for a moment, all that remained inside Gracie's diner was the fading thrum of the Black Hawk's blades echoing through the window panes. Then came the stillness, not emptiness, but that hollowed kind of silence that follows something sacred, the kind of silence people don't dare interrupt. A pause thick with understanding, but still starved for context. Walt Mallory had returned to his seat. He moved slowly now, with a visible stiffness that seemed more about memory than pain. His hands hovered above the metal box, then settled on either side of his plate. He did not touch the toast. He did not drink his coffee. He simply sat, spine upright, gaze distant, as though part of him had already stepped outside, chasing a memory that had been stirred awake by rotor wind and recognition. The two young men who had mocked him stood near the corner of the room, awkward and exposed. Their earlier bravado had drained out of them, leaving only a stiff residue of shame they didn't know how to wash off. One of them cleared his throat softly, but didn't speak. The other reached for his phone, hesitated, then quietly slipped it back into his pocket. It was the older waitress, the one with the tired eyes and the steady hands, who approached the booth first. She didn't say anything at first, just placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table beside Walt, replacing the one that had long gone cold. Her movements were gentle, almost reverent. "Mr. Mallory," she said softly, folding her towel in her hands, "may I ask, who was that man?" Walt blinked, slowly coming back into the present. His eyes drifted toward the door as if expecting Briggs to return. When he didn't, Walt exhaled, not in frustration or grief, but in relief. Like something that had been sitting heavy on his chest had finally been lifted. "Thomas Briggs," he said quietly, the name carrying weight in the air. "Colonel now. Was a lieutenant when I met him. Didn't know his left hand from his compass back then." The waitress gave a faint smile, unsure whether she was allowed to laugh. Walt continued, eyes still on the window, voice smooth but tired. "Signal School, Fort Monmouth, 1965. He was green, too fast, too eager. Burned through drills like they were nothing, but missed everything that mattered." He paused. "Nearly got himself court-martialed over a misrouted encryption relay during a NATO test. Would have been the end of him. But I pulled him out, showed him how to slow down. Think, listen." There was no pride in his tone, only memory, only truth. "Didn't do it for a medal," he added. "Didn't do it for thanks. Just knew he was worth saving." A man from the counter, one of the older regulars who usually ate in silence, spoke from across the room, voice low but clear. "You served long?" Walt didn't look at him. He nodded once. 26 years. Korean Peninsula, then Germany, then back stateside to train the next ones. Never fired a weapon in anger after 53. But I made sure the ones who did had the right frequencies in their ear and the right minds leading them." The man nodded, and the room absorbed his words like rain on dry earth. The younger waitress came forward now, more tentative. She'd heard bits of this before, rumors from regulars, whispers about the quiet one in the booth, but never this, never from Walt himself. "Why bring the medal today?" she asked, her voice hesitant but honest. "If you don't mind me asking." Walt looked down at the box, resting quietly beside his untouched toast. "Because I almost didn't bring it at all," he said, fingers brushing the velvet casing. "Every year on this day I take it out. Not for me, for them, for the ones who didn't come back, for the signals that never reached home. But I always keep it in the drawer. Felt like no one needed to see it anymore. Thought maybe it didn't matter." He looked up slowly, meeting the eyes of everyone who now watched him. "But today I needed to remind myself. And I guess the wind carried more than I expected. The room stayed still. No clapping, no cheering, just quiet reverence. And then the younger of the two boys stepped forward, almost unsure of his own legs. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Sir, I didn't know. We didn't know." Walt looked at him, not with scorn, but with something softer. The sternness in his eyes had not vanished, but beneath it, there was clarity, understanding. "No," he said, not unkindly. "You didn't." The boy fidgeted. "We were just messing around, but it wasn't right. What we did, what we said." Walt studied him for a long moment. Then, with the same hand that had once aligned radios in a foreign field under firelight, he gestured gently toward the booth seat across from him. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you." The other boy hesitated, then joined. Their postures were no longer cocky. They leaned forward slightly, as if afraid to miss what might come next. Walt nodded once. "Now listen." The boys sat across from Walt Mallory in stunned silence. Their heads were slightly bowed, eyes no longer roaming but rooted to the man in front of them, like students finally understanding the weight of a lesson too long avoided. Neither touched the silverware in front of them. They didn't fidget. They just listened, not to stories, but to stillness, the kind that speaks louder than recollections. Walt didn't launch into a tale. He didn't unroll names or years like some parade of past glory. Instead, he spoke in measured fragments of cold nights at field posts, the fear of silence on a radio line, the sound of a voice coming through static that meant someone was still alive. He mentioned no battles by name, no medals besides the one before him, and never once did he call himself brave, only prepared. The shift in the diner was not a single moment. It happened like dusk, slow, enveloping. One by one, the patrons who had fallen into stunned silence began to see the room differently. The man at the counter with the Marine Corps pin stood quietly, stepped toward the booth, and placed a $5 bill on Walt's table. He said nothing, just touched the edge of the table once with 2 fingers and returned to his seat. The older waitress returned with a slice of pie she hadn't been asked for, setting it gently in front of Walt without a word, then sliding a napkin beside it with shaking hands. "I made it this morning," she said simply. "Apple." Walt gave the slightest nod. Others followed in small ways. A man in coveralls walked up, placed a paper cup lid from his coffee over the metal box, shielding it from view as if offering it privacy. An elderly woman across the room folded a small American flag from her purse and left it on the edge of the counter, not as a decoration, but as recognition. They didn't announce anything. They simply adjusted the air around him. The 2 young men remained at the booth, saying little. But one of them, the taller one, reached into his jacket and pulled something from the inside pocket, a crumpled fast food receipt. He smoothed it out on the table, then carefully folded it into a rough triangle, the best his hands could manage. Then he placed it beside the metal box. "It's not much," he said, eyes lowered. "Just wanted to leave something behind." Walt didn't touch it, but he didn't dismiss it either. He let it sit there, a boy's apology, folded in paper and sincerity. From the kitchen, the owner of the diner emerged, a stocky man with a white apron, his forearms dusted with flour. He approached the table, eyes scanning the booth, then glancing to the back of the diner where a row of framed photos hung in a dusty line. Local events, birthdays, a picture of Gracie herself breaking ground on the diner 3 decades ago. He paused, then spoke to the waitress softly. "Clear that back wall," he said. "Tomorrow morning I want a new frame up, big one." He turned to Walt. "If you have a photo," he said, voice firm but warm, "bring it in. We'll hang it." Walt blinked slowly, the lines in his face folding deeper as he tried to summon words that had not been needed in years. "I don't have many," he said after a pause, "but I've got one that matters. Then that's the one we'll use." Outside, the Black Hawk was gone. The sky beyond the window was calm again. The wind had settled, the trees no longer trembling, but the world inside the diner had changed. Walt picked up his fork again. This time, he took a bite of the pie. And across the diner, those who watched did not see a frail man chewing his breakfast. They saw a sentinel, a man who had stood guard for a generation without asking to be seen. The bell above the diner door jingled, same as always. Its sound was soft, barely noticeable beneath the low chatter of breakfast orders and the clink of utensils on plates. But this morning, it seemed to carry a little farther. Heads turned, not in alarm, in expectation. Walt Mallory stepped through the doorway with the same quiet precision as always. Coat buttoned neatly, boots clean despite the mud outside, shoulders slightly stooped, but spine still straight. His gait was slow, but his steps were even, measured, proud. He removed his cap gently, nodded once to the room, and headed toward the back booth. But it wasn't just any booth anymore. The seat had been reupholstered since last week, the old cracking vinyl replaced with deep brown leather. The wall behind it now bore a newly mounted frame, large and clean, with a photograph encased behind polished glass. It was black and white, slightly faded. A younger Walt in uniform, standing beside a radio tower with his cap tucked under his arm, wind curling at his collar, eyes steady on something just outside the frame. Below the photo, a small bronze plaque had been fixed to the wall, reserved for Walter Mallory Signalman, Sentinel, Friend. The lettering was simple, no rank, no embellishment, just truth. As Walt approached, two older men already seated near the front stood without being asked. One of them saluted briefly, the other just nodded and placed his hat over his heart. The same waitress, the one who always remembered the toast, no butter, arrived at the table a few seconds after Walt settled in. She didn't need to ask his order. She placed the cup of black coffee down before him, followed by rye toast and a fresh cloth napkin. "Morning, Walt," she said with a small smile. "Morning," he replied. "No more, no less." The diner was busier than usual, not crowded, but full in the kind of way that spoke of intention. Faces that hadn't been seen in years had returned. A man in a worn Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. A younger guy in a wheelchair with a faded army tee and a missing sleeve. A woman who walked with a cane and sat beside her father, her medals left in a velvet box on the table beside her. Word had spread. Not loudly, not virally, just through whispers, phone calls, coffee shop talk. There was a man in town, a man who had never asked for anything, and so finally had been given something he could never have requested, to be seen. And so, quietly, something new began. Every Thursday morning that booth remained empty until Walt arrived. No matter who got there first, no one ever sat in it without him. And more, others began arriving too, not for the coffee, or the pie, or the hash browns, but to sit in the presence of someone who reminded them what quiet strength looked like, what respect meant, what it felt like to be part of a tradition worth preserving. Even the boys, the two who had nearly ruined everything, came back. Not every week, but often enough. They sat near the back, always together, always quiet. They never recorded anything, never raised their voices. One of them started carrying a small notepad. He didn't write in it often, just sometimes when Walt spoke. And Walt did speak now. Not long stories, just pieces, moments, lessons. He didn't boast, he didn't preach, but he shared. And they listened. The new rhythm of the diner grew steady. Veterans Thursday, they called it. Unofficial, unscheduled, but understood. And in the quiet of it all, Walter Mallory sat at his booth by the window, sipping black coffee, watching the morning sun rise through the blinds. A man of integrity, a man of duty, a man who had once carried signals through the silence of war, and now, finally, was heard. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and did this story bring back any memories you carry with you? Your words keep their stories alive. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.